With 7 years of experience, Lauren shares her unique approach, blending compassion, evidence-based practices, and a commitment to dismantling diet culture. Discover Lauren's journey in empowering individuals with passion and resilience through nutrition. Stay tuned. Lauren Comunale is a health at every size aligned dietitian who is passionate about helping clients achieve food freedom. She believes in a non-diet approach to help clients meet their goals and find balance. Her unique experience allows her to provide expertise for individuals managing chronic illnesses and eating disorder recovery. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you.
Lauren, I want to dive right into the topic that we have here today, but I do want to take a step back and understand a little bit more around your background and more so your personal journey and how it really led you to this intersection within managing chronic illnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I became a dietitian in 2016, and around that time, there was definitely a push for new grads for going into, the clinical world. So working in hospitals. It was also where a lot of the jobs were. And my first job it was a medium-sized community hospital in Rockville, Maryland. And when I was there, I kind of had this thought of, well, I need to find something to specialize in. What am I going to specialize in? And so I ended up really trying out a little bit of everything. I like to say I became kind of a jack of all trades. I think I covered, at some point in the 5 years I was there, almost every unit in the hospital. I worked medical surgical, neurology, orthopedics, the cardiac unit, ICU. I even did like labor and delivery, mother, baby. And working all these different units, you kind of have to be, in a sense, almost like a mini nutrition expert in all these different, disease states, chronic illnesses. And from that, I ended up developing such a very broad, I guess you would say, education around a lot of different disease states. And that's what really got me interested in it. And then from there, I was like, well, gosh, now I really don't know what I'm going to specialize in or really focus my career on. And which I'll talk about this later down the line when I eventually made the switch into working with people with eating disorders. That's when I was like, oh my gosh, like this clicks. Like I can morph both of these things together. And this is awesome. So that's a little bit of the, I guess, background of how I gained a lot of my experience and education and interest around working with individuals with chronic illnesses.
That's very helpful, and I do want to step back from it. I do want to come back to that in a second. But how did some of your early experiences within nutrition, health, really shape your understanding of this relationship between what is chronic illnesses and then eating habits itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting, I grew up, of course, like in the 90s, early 2000s, and I grew up in a very health conscious household, definitely some fear and judgment around certain food. And there's a couple of different chronic illnesses that run in my familial medical history. And I just remember kind of growing up and hearing things like, well, don't eat too much of that, or, this is going to happen to you, and kind of almost having a little bit of fear around certain foods. And no shame, of course, on my parents. They were doing, I think, the best they could with the information that they had in the times that, we were in, especially, like I said, like in the 90s, I think there was really the big focus around low fat. Fat was kind of really demonized a lot, in the media. And then we kind of move into the early 2000s where it's more of the low carb, and carbs are bad, and that's the thing about nutrition science. It's always changing. And, you kind of hear this thing's good. And then the next year, this thing's bad. And so the way I kind of joke about this is I went into nutrition, I think, for the wrong reasons. And what I mean by that is just when I wanted to become a dietitian, I think I had the same view of dietitians that I think a lot of the general population does, where it's kind of like we're the food police, we'll tell you what to eat, what not to eat. And then I get to, nutrition, I get to nutrition school, that's what I'll call it. And I realize I'm like, this is actually so not what we do. And it's a great thing, obviously. So I think they're kind of, like I said, like from my early experiences, a lot of fear and it's very that typical of like, well, you've got to eat this and that. You have to eat super healthy or else you're going to, develop, different issues down the line or different chronic illnesses. And I then, as I went through school and then, started my career, I realized that, there's actually so much more here. Like, of course, nutrition is very important, but there's so much more here in chronic illness management and managing overall, like, our health. So I think that's just kind of the way I like to describe it.
That's very helpful. Now, help us also understand when you first became aware of sort of this impact that nutrition can have, perhaps certain instances that you can share about this impact on chronic conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things when I talk about nutrition and chronic illness is the thing that I like to really highlight is the importance of eating enough, if that makes sense. And of course, this is, of course, very relevant in my work with eating disorders. There's so much focus with nutrition and chronic illnesses where it's like, I think there's a lot of restriction focus in a sense, especially like, for instance, like diabetes, the message that you get is, watch your carbs, make sure that you're not eating too much carbs. But there's really not a lot of focus on the fact of like, the body needs to be overall nourished in general. We need to make sure that we're eating enough calories, enough of each macronutrient, no matter what chronic illness you have, we need to make sure that our body is getting enough. Because if our body at the baseline is not getting enough nutrition, it's really hard for the body to do what it needs to do. And then at the same time, manage the chronic illness that's going on. And I really hate using this word, but managing like the inflammation that can happen in the body, And so that became really apparent to me when I started working in the hospital. And, as a dietitian, you get a consult and it's like, okay, well, go tell this person, their blood sugar is very high, so they must be eating too many carbs. Go tell them, what they should be eating. And then you go and I find out that I access their nutrition intake and I find out that they're not eating enough in general, or they're eating not enough of all the different things that they need in their diet, or not enough balance. And that happened to me a lot in the hospital, and a lot of my conversations with patients dealing with chronic illnesses. Of course, there's education about specifically, how to help manage their chronic illness with nutrition. But a lot of it is a focus around eating enough and making sure that they're getting enough and enough nourishment and basic. And yeah, that's something that I think we don't think about a lot.
And as you then transition your role with really assisting clients with eating disorder recovery, how do you integrate nutritional guidance into your approach with clients? Because again, chronic conditions are complicated enough to begin with. How do you draw that intersection?
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, it can be so, it can be really, I guess it really differs from person to person. And when I first meet with somebody, of course, it's okay, well, tell me, what are you eating now? What are you eating now? And a lot of it is also assessing, what have you been told to eat? What have you been told by, your past doctors or other healthcare professionals, or what is it that, you're hearing in the media that might be influencing the way you eat? And with that, I find a lot of times it's, I heard I can't have this or I can't have that, or, I have to restrict this. And with that, it's really going back to the basics of, okay, are we eating enough? So, are we getting the carbohydrates that our body needs? Are we getting the protein that our body needs? Are we getting the fat that our body needs? Are we also making sure that we're getting the micronutrients, like the vitamins and minerals that our bodies need? So really, before I do any work around, adjusting maybe their nutrition for their chronic illness, it's this really focus of, are you eating enough? Are you eating consistently? Are you nourishing yourself throughout the day? Because a lot of times I find it's like, I wake up and maybe I don't eat until 5 p.m. And I'm like, okay, well, we maybe need to, let's get a little more consistent here. And of course, I do believe that some people might have different eating habits, or they might not necessarily eat, the kind of typical 3 square meals a day that we talk about. Like, different things work for other people, but for kind of general, management of one's nutrition and their chronic illness, and overall just their, hunger, fullness cues, and just regulating their eating, I really try to help clients get more of on a consistent eating schedule. So it's really kind of, like I said, getting back to the basics. Are you eating enough? Are you eating consistently? Are you nourishing yourself? Are you not going too long during the day without eating? Are you including snacks? Are your snacks balanced? Or, do they also include protein and carbs and fat? And so it really is, a lot of kind of, again, like building that foundation first. Yeah.
What are some of the indicators of eating disorder, and what challenges are really faced with managing chronic illness and then eating disorder recovery as well?
Yeah. And so it's interesting because eating disorders can look very differently for different people. And, we can't just look at someone and say, oh, they have an eating disorder. I see clients who have eating disorders and also co-occurring, chronic illnesses in all shapes, sizes, backgrounds, ages, and so one of the biggest, I think, indicators for me, of course, and again, it's really assessing, are they eating enough, and assessing what are their eating habits, what are their eating patterns and behaviors around food. A lot of times this is when I hear a lot of maybe fear-based talk around food. Oh, well, my doctor told me that I can't have this. So, I've been avoiding all carbs, or I've been avoiding all fats, or I've been only eating protein. And that really leads me into one of the biggest challenges of my job, especially working with clients who have chronic illness and then also an eating disorder or disordered eating going on, is the misinformation. And people in our lives, like our friends, our loved ones, other healthcare professionals, all, of course, mean very well. But what I found is everybody has an opinion, and everyone eats. So everybody thinks, I'm an expert in nutrition. It's very much like, I think nutrition is one of the only fields where I think people, might not have any education at all, but they're like, oh, well, I eat like this and it worked for me, so this must work for everybody. And that's just not true. It just isn't. And so again, with that, it's really dealing with a lot of misinformation. So a lot of fear-based kind of beliefs around certain foods, a lot of misconceptions around certain foods. I've mentioned this a couple times, but like, a really common thing that I get a lot is somebody who might have diabetes. They might come to me and they might be like, oh, well, I really don't eat carbs. And I'm like, okay, well, who told you that? And they're like, oh, it was, my doctor or so-and-so. And then again, also, other healthcare professionals also really, for the most part, just mean well. But one thing I do like to say is, let's maybe leave the nutrition nutrition information to the dietitians. And so with that, I'm like, well, no, you can have carbs. That's okay. And one thing that I think really shocks a lot of my clients when I tell them this is the brain alone needs, I mean, it depends on the person, but anywhere from like 120 to 130 to 140 even grams of carbs just for the brain to function. And it puts into perspective that, even if you are dealing with, diabetes, our body still needs carbs. And so that is a really common, I think, misconception I get a lot with clients. And, again, somebody who's dealing with a chronic illness, they hear from their doctor, you need to change your diet, you need to do this, this, and this. And then, of course, this person wants to be as healthy as they can. So then sometimes that's when it can turn into this really kind of severe, like I'm not eating any carbs, or I'm not eating any fat, or any of this. And so with that, it's definitely doing a lot of, okay, let's try to relearn some things. Let's try to challenge some of these things. And a really unfortunate aspect as well is that in just general, kind of mainstream medicine, people aren't screened for eating disorders very much. It's just not something that we're thinking about.
And then how do you really incorporate a holistic approach to nutrition in managing chronic illnesses? You mentioned a minute ago, things like misinformation, but in this clutter of information sometimes, how do you really look at, again, this holistic approach to nutrition and still be able to manage your health better and then cut out all the noise?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I really love talking to clients about, where, yes, nutrition is very important. And, of course, I'm a dietitian, so it's what I've decided to study, and it's what I specialize in. So of course, I think nutrition is extremely important. But I think also thinking holistically, nutrition and the one's eating patterns and one's eating habits is really just one piece of the puzzle. So again, looking at a more holistic approach, when I'm talking to clients, yes, I'm assessing their intake and what they're eating and how much they're eating and how often they're eating. But another really big part of it that we don't think about a lot is some of these other dimensions of health that are really important. So looking at one's emotional health, their social health, of course, again, physical health is important. And so with that, it's also assessing, okay, well, how is your sleep? How are your stress levels? What is your movement like? What is your social health like? Do you have a community around you? Do you have supports? And all those things with nutrition, I think, are all very important things to assess, especially, thinking more of a holistic approach, because these are all things that can also they can also impact one's health and the way that their chronic illness is being managed as well. And and especially thinking specifically for stress. Stress can wreak so much havoc on the body. And if we have somebody who's not managing their stress levels, and so they're living constantly with elevated cortisol levels in the body, that is, no matter what they're doing, they could be, doing all the quote unquote right things with their eating. But if you're not sleeping, or if you're not managing your stress, it's really hard to manage your chronic illness and to overall just manage life. So it's really thinking, of course, nutrition is important, but it's really just one piece of the puzzle here too.
Diet culture can really be pervasive. How do you navigate and challenge diet culture beliefs in the work that you do?
Oh, yes. This is one of my favorite ones. Yeah. With that, it really is. It's a lot of education, and it's also a lot of exploration as well with the client. With diet culture, it's something that for a lot of people is a lot of these beliefs are very deep rooted. So when I'm kind of in that more exploration kind of, phase with the client, is asking a lot of questions. So what is diet culture? So it's even naming what is that because a lot of people, they come to me and that's the first time they've ever heard that term. And then it's like the light bulb goes off. It's like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. So what is diet culture? How do I identify diet culture in my daily life? Where did these beliefs come from for me? And like I'd said, a lot of times these beliefs are very deep rooted. They're things that people learned in childhood that were repeated and repeated by their parents. And these were things that were repeated by their parents. And so it ends up being a lot of, again, education, a lot of relearning and rethinking the way we think about food and we think about bodies and the way that we approach food. And I think a really important aspect of that is also assessing and doing a lot of work around weight stigma and fat phobia and how this is extremely present in our society. You know, we live in a society that less is more, thin is better. You know, we connect certain like moral virtue to certain ways of eating and certain body types. And so it's a lot of exploration around that as well. So yeah, and that is something I find it can take, it takes a bit of time. And with that, I have lots of compassion for my clients because these are really deep rooted things. And they're also things that it's like our session is maybe an hour a week. So we can work on challenging diet culture beliefs. And then the client walks out their door and they're immediately inundated with all the messaging, you know, advertisements, you know, it's everywhere you see. Diet culture is everywhere and it's normalized in our society as well. And so it's definitely a lot of gentle challenging and a lot of kind of compassion on my part for the client and throwing in some healthy challenging and kind of relearning as well. Yeah.
What opportunities do you see for advocacy in changing the narrative around nutrition, chronic illness, eating disorders? And then how do you hope to really make a lasting impact here? You know, just a couple of minutes ago, you talked about how folks turn to their doctors and doctors provide sort of this information that's really half-baked, right? Because they're and to their credit, they're just not trained in that way to provide that nutrition information, right?
Absolutely.
And so where do you see those opportunities to advocate for this work?
Yes, absolutely. And I really think a big part of that is continuing to advocate and educate around health at every size. So, you know, when we think about health at every size, what that means is anybody in any body can achieve health and can engage in health promoting activities, no matter what their size is. And so it's really kind of a lot of focus around that. And again, kind of like I mentioned, I think we have a very narrow view of health in our society. A lot of times we label health as a certain way of eating, a certain way that somebody looks, a certain weight, or, you know, certain kinds of, you know, I guess like how much exercise you do and things like that. But health can look so different for many different people, and that's okay. And again, like anybody in any body can engage in health promoting activities. Anybody in any body can achieve health, and they can achieve their own version of health. And so it's continuing to really do a lot of work around that. And when I do come across maybe some other healthcare professionals who aren't super aligned with that, you know, I always try to have a conversation around that. And just kind of, again, because it's really just, unfortunately, it's not something that is super, I guess, understood in our society. You know, it's not so much a mainstream kind of belief. So really doing a lot of work around that. And of course, definitely doing a lot of education with my clients around that as well. And with that, you know, I really support, you know, the idea of all foods fit. And even no matter what, you know, is going on with your health or what maybe chronic illness you might be dealing with, all foods can fit in our diets. Now, we might have different kinds of foods. We might have different amounts of certain foods depending on what's going on, but all foods can fit, and that's okay. And I think another part around that is in our society, when somebody does develop a chronic illness, a lot of times we play the blame game, the shame game, where it's, oh, well, maybe if you ate a little bit healthier, then maybe this wouldn't happen to you. Or maybe if you were a little bit more active, this wouldn't have happened to you. When in reality, that's not actually true. There's so many reasons why somebody might develop a chronic illness. And one of the huge reasons are our genetics, unfortunately. So I think also doing a lot of advocacy around that like, we can't blame people for their health. We can't kind of put the shame on that. And kind of along with that, hoping, how I hope to make a lasting impact with that is, I really want my clients and I want people to know that you can manage your chronic illness without doing it in a restrictive way or without, cutting out certain foods. You can also find food freedom no matter what is going on. So that's kind of a really big thing that I try to advocate for.
And there are a couple of themes that came across in what you said. So I heard food positive language, body positive language, inclusivity, advocacy, and education. There's a lot for us to do there. What advice would you give, and especially to our listeners here, our audience here, what advice would you give to others who are really trying to foster a healthy relationship with food and nutrition? Where do they start?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with that, it's a lot of balance. I think, again, really focusing on like all foods fit. So, and also focusing on variety, focusing on that balance, and focusing on also, how do you feel and how does your body feel? And with that, I do a lot of work around, well, what is my body actually telling me? Is this hunger? Is this fullness? What am I in the mood for? What sounds good? What is accessible? A lot of times I think we kind of are under the notion of like, oh, well, like I'm in the mood for maybe a sandwich, but I should actually have a salad. It's like, well, no, your body actually is probably telling you that you probably need the sandwich. You need the nutrients. And so really trying to think about food in a less restrictive way and more of like, well, all foods can fit, but also at the same time, how can I then achieve this balance while I'm practicing this all foods fit? And I think a huge part of that is understanding that food, yes, it is fuel, of course. Food at the same time can also be so many other things. It can be social connection. It can be nostalgia. It can be pleasure, it can be culture, it can be connection with our family. And so food, yes, it is fuel, but it also can be so many other things. So, yeah.
That's very helpful. And with that, unfortunately, Lauren, we are toward the end of the episode. Can you tell our listeners how they can connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a private practice dietitian, and I work for the private practice Courage to Nourish. We have an office, we've 2 offices in Maryland and an office in Virginia. So I would encourage listeners to check out our website. It's couragetonourish.com. We also have a blog that, is updated pretty much monthly on a lot of different topics around eating disorders, all foods fit, health at every size. So it's a really great way to learn a little bit more about this. And then we also have, our practice has an Instagram as well, and it's courage.to.nourish on Instagram. And there's also a lot of really great things posted on there as well.
Lovely. And we'll link up everything in the show notes below so folks can click on it and find their way through. Awesome. With that, Lauren, thank you so very much for your time. To our listeners, you know what time it is. Head over to our social media and answer this super quick question, which is, how has community support played a role in your own health journey? Again, head over to @Yumlish on Facebook, on Instagram. Find us there. Find this podcast post. Comment below to tell us again, how has community support played a role in your own health journey? We'll continue the conversation there. And with that, Lauren, thank you again for your time.
Thank you.